I never set out to write a book about Franklin D. Roosevelt. I just sort of drifted into it. My field is naval history, and at one point I was thinking of possibly writing a book about the Magdalena Bay crisis, an obscure historical footnote concerning Japan's attempts to build a naval base on the Mexican coast in Baja California. I knew that Franklin Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in Woodrow Wilson's administration, and I was interested to see what papers he might have had relating to Magdalena Bay. So I drove over from my home in Connecticut to the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park. At the time, I had no interest whatsoever in writing about FDR himself. But sometimes things happen. The FDR Library is an amazing place. You have to wonder how any one man could have lived a life crowded with so much minutia. Hundreds of thousands of shelf feet given over to zillions and zillions of telegrams, legal briefs, state papers, personal letters, school book scribbles, secret cables, position papers, children's drawings, warnings, threats, scraps and details of vitally important political landmarks, and long-forgotten grand schemes that ran out of steam before they could be acted upon. I quickly discovered that there wasn't a whole lot about Magdalena Bay in the library. I wasn't that surprised. The crisis I was investigating had been more or less settled by the time Franklin Roosevelt arrived in Washington in 1913 to take up his duties in the Navy Department. But what did surprise me was that even a cursory glance through the library's indexes revealed a Franklin Roosevelt that I knew nothing about. I had grown up with FDR. He was the only president I knew until I was 15 years old. Like everyone else, I was aware that he had strong emotional ties to the sea and to the U.S. Navy in particular. His home, which I had visited in the past and which is next door to the library, is filled with naval prints, ship models, paintings, and other nautical paraphernalia. Clearly, he identified with the Navy. But until I examined various items in the library, I had no idea of how deep that identification ran, or how early it had manifested itself. You look at drawings of boats that he made when he was only 5 years old, and they are remarkably sophisticated. He understands gaff rigging. He gets the sails right. He knows where the halyards belong and how they work. It occurred to me that the FDR Library might hold something more interesting to me than the Magdalena Bay crisis, that his identification with the Navy represented not just one of his interests, but was in fact a very basic part of his character. To a very real extent, he seemed to have built his entire intellectual worldview around his understanding of the Navy. That is, he did not see the Navy as part of his worldview. He understood the world based on his view of the Navy. That was an interesting idea. If such were the case, one could view his entire political career, especially his years in the White House, as a reflection of his naval-centric worldview. The New Deal, his foreign policy, his fights with Congress and the Supreme Court, his leadership in World War II, his entire political career represented an inherently naval intelligence. That might make a book. So I began researching Franklin D. Roosevelt in earnest, and it eventually resulted in this book, Roosevelt's Navy, the education of the most powerful warrior president in American history. As is always the case with research, I came upon surprises. Undoubtedly, the biggest surprise to me was the more I looked into Franklin Roosevelt's early years, the more I kept bumping into another Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. And it quickly became evident to me that the influence of Theodore Roosevelt on the young Franklin, which is generally overlooked in most accounts of his life, was profound and far-reaching and would have to play an important part in the story of FDR and the Navy that I wanted to tell. But I get ahead of myself. The story begins, like most stories, at the beginning, and I'd like to read a little from chapter 1. A boy sits alone, quietly reading a book. Elsewhere in the house, the familiar sounds of servants going about their daily chores are punctuated now and then by the calm, authoritative voice of his mother or father supervising their activities. But the boy is oblivious to everything except the book in his hands. The time is somewhere in the early 1890s, and the boy is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is about 10 or 11 years old, and the book he is reading represents something of a challenge. It is filled with unfamiliar technical terms, complicated charts, and curious diagrams. But because it is also filled with the clash of combat and the smell of gunpowder, and is crowded with thrilling accounts of daring do in the age of fighting sail, the boy is enraptured and reads with the focused intensity of youth, totally lost in its pages. He is sitting in the library of Springwood, his family's country home in the village of Hyde Park, overlooking the Hudson River, about 70 miles north of New York City. We cannot be precisely sure when he first read the book he is holding, but we know that he read it at an early age, certainly before his teens, and we know that it would have a powerful influence upon him throughout his life. It is almost certainly the single most important book he will ever read. The book that has so captured his attention is entitled The Naval War of 1812. From early childhood, Franklin has been fascinated with the sea and things maritime. He is an avid sailor, and under his father's watchful tutelage, he has learned his seamanship in knockabouts and ice boats and other small craft, and has served as crew on his father's 51-foot sailing yacht, Half Moon, during summers on Campobello Island in the Bay of Fundy, where the family keeps a cottage. But it is not the subject matter that has drawn him to the Naval War of 1812, so much as the fact that the book is written by his distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, of the Oyster Bay branch of the family. Young Franklin knows and greatly admires his ebullient, fun-loving 35-year-old cousin Ted, who enjoys inventing strenuous games for children and who, after a day of running and shouting, likes nothing better than to gather everyone around the fire and tell them ripping tales of his adventures as a cowboy in the Dakota Territory. At this point in his life, Theodore has already made a considerable name for himself as a writer, but has not yet progressed as far as he would like in his other chosen interest, politics. At the moment, he is still a relatively obscure Washington functionary in the Civil Service Commission. World fame still lies in the future. But to those who already know him, his dynamism and boisterous energy already define his character. Throughout his life, Franklin will habitually refer to his fifth cousin, Theodore, with genuine awe as the most wonderful man I ever knew. The book is filled with Theodore's infectious patriotism and his delight in the exploits of the gallant and glamorous commodores who led America's early Navy. Stephen Decatur, Oliver Hazard Perry, David Porter, and the rest. But Theodore Roosevelt has not limited his narrative to heroes alone. Woven into his celebration of their adventures are broader points on the strategic value of navies in general, and of the unique role they play in shaping and carrying out national policy. He explains how warships can reach across the globe to enforce the national resolve thousands of miles from home, as even the tiny American Navy managed to do in the War of 1812, when Yankee frigates engaged the enemy off the coast of Africa and as far away as the waters of Brazil and the Marquesas. Cousin Ted points out that when navies are large enough to be organized into fleets, they can wield devastating power in combat, much as Nelson did at Trafalgar, or in equally effective manner, choke off an enemy's supply lines by blockading its coast. And he makes it clear that navies are just as important in peacetime